in the late 70s, who was president of the United States?
Carter.
Jimmy Carter. And in 1979, he appointed Paul Volcker chair of the Federal Reserve. Now, here's a trivia question, and if you know the answer to this, you're really good. Who had been the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve before Paul Volcker was appointed? You remember President Carter shuffled his cabinet, and he made the guy who had been chairman of the Fed went on to be Secretary of the Treasury, I believe. So who became Bert Lance? Wait a minute.
No.
No, I don't think so. Okay. G. William Miller. Bill Miller. Okay, anyway, trivia. Now, when Paul Volcker comes in, what does Paul Volcker decide to do that's totally different?
Target inflation. No.
Well, yes, what he decides to do is make curbing inflation his top priority. Now, he can't do it immediately. He can't do it immediately because of the circumstances, and we won't have to get into details. But by 1981 and 82, he can focus his interest, and he can focus on that. Let's put it that way. And in 1981-82, the Fed begins to pursue a drastic contractionary policy. Even though the economy had not yet recovered fully from its recession of 1980, despite that. And remember, in the past, always when the economy needed to recover, the Fed permitted it to recover with low interest rates. This time, different. Does anybody recall what the prime rate was? Well, it's up there, isn't it? The prime rate got as high, I believe, as 21.5% in 1981. Does anybody remember how high first mortgage loan rates got? 18%. Car loan rates, 25%. Unbelievable, right? I mean, you can't, in today's perspective, it's unbelievable to have interest rates like that. I mean, if we had interest rates like that today, everything would stop. Well, everything almost stopped, and it was a horrendous recession. But a horrendous recession driven by a drop in demand, right? There was huge unemployment, for instance, in the northern counties of California, up by Humboldt Bay, up there on the coast. Del Norte County, Humboldt County, I think here in California, in those counties, we had 30% rates of unemployment because all the sawmills shut down, all the lumber mills shut down. It was really a serious recession. Nationally, the unemployment rate got to 10.5%. Today it's 4 point something, right? Like 4.5%. Then it got 10.5. And in Michigan, the rate of unemployment was much higher. It was very, very serious. But what happened to the rate of inflation? It fell. And from then on, the Fed made its bias reducing inflation, not stimulating employment. But the ironic thing was that just as stimulating employment had in the long run, ironically and counterintuitively, driven interest rates up because it drove inflation up, when the Fed made its major priority fighting inflation, what in the long run counterintuitively happened to interest rates? In the long run, they fell. Remember, when the Fed's number one priority had been full employment, interest rates in the long run went up. In the long run. Remember? We just spent 15 minutes talking about it. Now, when the Fed makes fighting inflation its number one priority, which ironically you do by raising rates, what happened to the rates in the long run? They fell because in the long run, what happened to inflation? It fell. Does everybody get it? So, for instance, 1984, the economy began to strengthen a little. Recovery began. And as soon as recovery began, What did the Fed do? Push up rates again, cooled the economy, inflation fell some more, down came rates some more. But every time the economy surged a little, the Fed raised the rate, so inflation never had a chance to get started again. Even in the late 90s, when inflation was very low, the Fed pushed rates up. Today, is inflation a big threat? Not really, especially if you strip out fuel prices. But even today, the Fed, by the day I mean recently, the Fed pushed rates up. And of course, the long run trend though has been south. Does everybody get it? And so now, what I tried to do in all this, is weave in the housing starts and the auto sales. Remember we talked about that cycle? Okay, let's review. Under the old economy, every time there was a boom, what happened to inflation? Increase and interest rates up.
Yep.
And so every slump in housing starts was initiated with a big jump in interest rates. So on. Lately, we've had a housing boom unlike any other. We looked at the numbers, didn't we? And lately, we've had a housing slump, the beginnings of a slump. Initiated by inflation? Not really. Initiated by very high interest rates? Not really, because this is the prime rate, but the mortgage rates really haven't gone up that much, have they? They didn't raise that much. Not like they did in the past. And so the mortgage rates are still around 6% or so, aren't they? And that's not 5, but still, so we've had a very different kind of housing cycle this time. Everybody? So we're in uncharted territory. And that's what makes the economy in the last 10 years, what we call the new economy, so interesting. What was different about 95 to 2000? What was different, it was led not by the consumer, that is, housing starts and auto sales, but by business investment in new plant and equipment. Remember we talked about the technology? What led the economy from 2000 to 2005? This time it was the consumer, and that's the reason the economy really didn't slump that bad. But what drove it? A deliberate attempt by the Fed to bring interest rates down, and which worked, and drove housing starts, drove residential construction. And now we've got this slump, right? This slump in real estate. If we go back to home starts or home sales or, any one of these numbers we were looking at. This is existing homes. Here's new homes. Any one of them, you can see the slump. It's a little different this time, but it all has depended very much on the Federal Reserve, hasn't it, and Federal Reserve policy.